Session 7. Efforts in reducing the negative impact of loss of correspondent banking relationships in the Caribbean. The role of supervisors and financial institutions. Introduction. Although this session is mainly addressed to Caribbean regulation and supervision authorities, it is important to point out that the best practices in AML-CFT supervision could even be considered a useful tool for supervised institutions. This is because methodology and standards applied by supervisors works as a guideline for supervised entities, mainly in their role as a local respondent banks. If we see what our supervisors will do as financial institutions, we'll be ready to answer their questions and to respond to their assessments. We already reviewed concepts as risk assessment, risk factors, or weight, which will be used during the course of the session, and they will allow the participants to understand methodologies under analysis. And finally, it is important to highlight that the final objective of knowing about best practices in AML-CFT supervision is no other than to contribute to prevent events of de-risking in Caribbean financial institutions. So how can we conduct a correspondent banking assessment methodology? In our case, we have developed a 3-stage assessment methodology. In the first place, we conduct a foreign bank's risk assessment to see the risk level of the bank involved in the correspondent relationship. Then we see the exposure assessment in 2 ways. First, the relationship, it means the number of high-level risk banks we are working with, and the transactional volumes with this high-risk level banks. But why do we separate volumes from numbers? It's because sometimes we can have banking relationship with high-risk level banks, but the transactional volume is low. So it should not be relevant compared with a high-level transactional volume entity. So we need to combine those 2 elements. And finally, we measure the bank's global exposure from correspondent banking. It means to assess the level of exposure to global risk of the local bank by its correspondent banking relationships. For instance, Bank of America has a great number of correspondent bank relationships, so they want to know the risk exposure regarding these matters, so the outcomes of the first and second steps I just mentioned. Bank of America could decide which banks they do not want to continue to work with. The first step, foreign banks risk assessment, has 3 criteria. The first one refers to the module we use as supervisors in Peru. For example, it's to assess the correspondent banking relationship risk related to AML. It is just a module. Each supervisor can develop or decide to use another system to evaluate. In Peru, we have the particularity that we ask the respondent banks to evaluate their correspondent banks. In our economy, as in the Caribbean, it is common to do it this way. For us, it is very important that the respondent banks are aware of the risks of the correspondent banks. Then we seek for the jurisdiction risk. We have 4 items in this criteria. First, if the jurisdiction, the country, has been negatively reviewed by the FATF, if it has a tax haven condition, we see the Basel's AML score and the Financial Secrecy Index. These last 2 indexes are quite important because they are conducted by independent bodies with their own criteria, methodology, which shows how the country is being evaluated by other authorities. And finally, we see the economic group risk. When we analyze correspondent banking relationships, we should look at the SWIFT code. In the graphic, we can see an example of a report in which we have the SWIFT code, the group the bank belongs, name, country, and if the bank has been investigated or sanctioned. If we look at ABLV Bank in Latvia, for instance, it hasn't been investigated but was sanctioned in 2018. At the end of the graphic, we can see 3 banks that belong to the group, Banca Popolare di Sondrio in Italy. You can see even though they belong to the same group, they have different SWIFT codes and none of them have been investigated or sanctioned. This example has over 400 correspondent banks we work with. We update it semi-annually with new banks and assess the risk as low, medium, and high, according to the criteria. The second step is to measure the exposure by relationships and volume. Here we can see the bank 1 to 4, the number of high, medium, and low risk correspondent banks that work with them. We first measure the relationships to define the risk level, and then we see the exposure by transactional volume. Then you can see a list of banks which we measure the volume of the correspondent banks for high, medium, and low risk, and the total volume as well. And the third and last step is about combining the 2 previous criteria and determining the bank's global exposure from correspondent banking. This gives us a score system. The graphic you can see now refers to the correspondent banking in the Caribbean Association of Banks, where we can see the numbers of banks they served. Now we can study which of the supervisory activities derived from correspondent banking assessment. It is important to mention that applying this assessment is not enough. Some of the supervisory activities have to be triggered from this assessment. So we'll give priority to the banks with a high-level exposure with the annual visitation plan, where we emphasize the review of high-risk correspondents, due diligence files, review of the correspondent contracts, and analysis of the controls and monitoring of correspondent operations. As a result of the correspondent bank assessment, it was possible to develop a regulatory directive that extends the scope of current regulations. 1. Minimum correspondence due diligence policies. 2. Enhanced due diligence regime and correspondent relations. 3. Treatment of transactions through intermediary. 4. The correspondent operations report sent to the superintendency. As we discussed in a previous presentation, here we can see which are the FATF recommendations to consider. As supervisors, we should take into consideration the 3 of them, mainly the number 13 correspondent banking, because they tell us what financial institutions must do. Therefore, what supervisors should evaluate. These items, as we can see, have 5 steps. A. Gather information about the respondent's business, the quality of supervision, if it has been subject to a MLTF investigation or regulatory action. B. Assess the respondent institution's AML-CFT controls. C. Obtain approval from senior management. D. Clearly understand the respective responsibilities, and E. With respect to payable through accounts, be satisfied that the respondent bank has conducted CDD on the customers. Why is it important to comply with the FATF recommendations? First, because we're going to be evaluated by FATF or a similar regional body, and second, because not complying with the recommendations translates into a negative view of the country in the mutual evaluation report published by FATF. The international bodies look for the results of these evaluations, and the rating agencies have given X country a grade of risk. And the local banks are more likely to be cut off their correspondent banking relationships if their jurisdictions have been negatively reviewed. Also, the FATF recommendations standardize the best AML-CFT practices for all financial institutions, making it easier for cross-border institutions to be aligned. What is asked for a financial institution in the Bahamas, for instance, is also asked in France or Nigeria. It allows to align the objectives of financial institutions regarding the AML program. In the same sense, when conducting the supervision of banks, subsidiaries in other jurisdictions which have different AML-CFT regulations, the recommendations may be used as base guidelines, because all financial institutions must comply with them. For example, 2 local banks in Peru have their branches in Panama, Bahamas, USA, and Bolivia. When supervisors do the review of these branches, the main guides are the FATF recommendations due to the different set of regulations each country has. The regulatory directive for correspondent banking has the following structure. 1. Application. Applies to all financial institutions. 2. The definitions of terms they use, which can differ from bank to bank. 3. General considerations in contracting with correspondents. 4. Correspondent bank's due diligence. 4.1. Stages of the correspondent bank's due diligence. 4.2. General correspondent bank's due diligence regime. 4.3. An enhanced correspondent bank's due diligence regime that works with the high-risk banks. 5. Then the special procedures when due diligence cannot be conducted. Sometimes the correspondent banks are not eager to answer the questionnaires sent by the respondent banks. 6. Third parties' due diligence is very important because what we have been seeing is that 60% of the correspondent banks' relationships use intermediaries. 7. Correspondent banking operations report. And 8. How they should validate this data. The main objectives for these directives are to standardize the definitions of correspondent bank and respondent banks, and make difference between SWITF exchange with foreign trade operations. Establish minimum information requirements in due diligence. Expand the scope of enhanced regime. Increase frequency of monitoring of banks' operations in the enhanced regime. And establish obligation to apply due diligence to third parties that participate in the operations. Correspondent of the correspondent and respondent of the respondent. That's all for now. Thank you for your attention. See you in the next section.